Thank you very much, and thank you all for coming. I think we have a really exciting and I think very important session today. And as people know, opioid addiction is really one of the most pressing problems of our time, and it's really a tragedy. But this is certainly an area where science and medicine can really help. So we have four terrific people speaking who are really doing, I think, outstanding work in different aspects. So I was going to ask them all to come up and share the stage. And Patrice Harris, who's president-elect of the American Medical Association, Sarah Akerman, who's a senior medical director at Alkermes, Michael Heffernan, who's chairman of Collegium Pharmaceuticals, and Corey McCann, who's president and chief executive officer of Pear Therapeutics. So let me, I think the important thing is that you get to hear from each of these individuals, and everybody's going to talk for about 10 minutes about give you some of their thoughts and some of the work that they and their companies or just the areas that they're thinking about. And then we wanted to open it for discussion with all of you. So let me just start with Patrice Harris. Patrice is going to open first. She's president-elect at the American Medical Association. She's had an amazing career. She's also in the faculty, or has been, at Emory. So she's going to educate us on the problems and related aspects. Patrice, thank you so much.
Thank you, Bob. Good morning, everyone, and good morning to the early risers. I am Patrice Harris, president-elect of the American Medical Association. It's a pleasure to be with you today to discuss new approaches to fight opioid addiction, which has proven to be a formidable adversary. Now, I look forward to hearing from my fellow panelists this morning about the wonderful new products that companies are developing. They are much needed and welcomed. As a psychiatrist, I'm a child psychiatrist and forensic psychiatrist, but I've done a lot of work in addictions. I can say again, much needed and welcomed. The AMA has long been a supporter of medical and scientific discovery. But as chair of the AMA's Opioid Task Force, I would submit to you that there is much more work that needs to be done on the policy side, and a lot more opportunity for partnerships in this area. As you will see, there are barriers to pain care and addiction treatment that we need to eliminate now to make it possible for more patients to benefit from existing and new products. Now, last year, and I'm sure you have seen this on the news, the CDC reported that overdoses fueled by the opioid epidemic have become the leading cause of death among Americans under the age of 50. In 2016, opioid overdoses, now predominantly from illicit fentanyl and heroin, claimed more than 42,000 lives. That's 116 lives per day. And I think it's important to emphasize the point about heroin and illicit fentanyl. This epidemic is evolving, will continue to evolve, has evolved. We have to make sure that our policy, our practice interventions, our products keep up with the evolution of the epidemic. The physicians of the American Medical Association understand that our profession has a responsibility to demonstrate leadership and to act to end this epidemic. In 2014, the AMA convened more than 25 national, state, specialty, and other healthcare associations and formed the Opioid Task Force. After careful study, we developed and issued 6 recommendations that you see here on the slides, geared toward physicians and how each of us can take action to end this epidemic. Increasing use of PDMPs, those are the state databases. Each state is different, but those are the state databases regarding opioid prescriptions. That's not a panacea. These PDMPs are not a panacea, but they are a very helpful clinical tool when they have up-to-date, actionable, real-time information. We absolutely want to enhance physicians' education and training starting in medical school. We absolutely support comprehensive treatment for patients both with pain and for those who have a substance use disorder. We support safe storage and disposal of opioids and all medications. Removing stigma, very critical. We need to do much more to reduce the stigma associated with those who have a substance use disorder, but unfortunately also with patients who have chronic pain. I've heard so many stories of patients who have pain who feel stigmatized when they go to the pharmacy to fill their prescriptions. And we have to continue to expand access to naloxone, that's the overdose reversal drug, in the community and through co-prescribing. The AMA recommends that physicians consider co-prescribing of naloxone to the patients that they believe are at risk of opioid overdose. Now, through the work of the Opioid Task Force and action by policymakers, we are beginning to make progress. There are encouraging national trends. Opioid prescribing has decreased for the 5th year in a row. Now, that is important. Absolutely, physicians should be judicious in our prescribing of opioids, but that cannot be the only story. We cannot just address prescription opioids. We have to make sure that as we are reducing the number of prescriptions, that our patients have alternatives to treat their pain. Prescription drug monitoring program registration and use continues to increase. We know that databases were accessed more than 300 million times in 2017, and that was a 121% increase from 2016. Treatment capacity is increasing, but as you will see from a later slide, not enough. And I think some of my other panelists will talk about that as well. But we do know that more than 50,000 physicians are certified to provide buprenorphine. That is evidence-based treatment for an opioid use disorder. We also have to make sure that we emphasize the words evidence-based as we discuss treatments that are available today and those tomorrow. We always have to make sure that the treatments are evidence-based. Physicians are enhancing our education. In 2017, nearly 500,000 physicians and others took CME, continuing medical education credit, in pain management and substance use disorders. And access to naloxone is rising, with prescriptions more than doubling in 2017. But this is a slide I want you to remember. If you only remember one thing that I talked to you about today. Policies to restrict opioid prescribing have done just that. But these efforts must be complemented, as I said earlier, by a much greater emphasis on prevention and treatment. Despite the need for treatment, despite the widespread recognition that treatment is the most important way to end this epidemic at this moment in time, people are not getting it. This slide shows the percent of the population needing but not receiving evidence-based treatment for substance use disorder. This is according to a national survey on drug use and health. In every state, the need far outpaces access. Nationally, about 90% of those needing treatment are able to get it. 90% of those needing treatment are unable to get it. Both the survey that I mentioned and the Surgeon General's spotlight on opioids issued earlier this month emphasized the dire need for treatment for those with a substance use disorder. So without a much greater national effort to provide treatment, more people will die. I want to say that again. Without a much greater national effort to provide treatment, more people will die. People should not die from an opioid use disorder when we know how to prevent it. In our 2018 Opioid Task Force report, we made the following recommendations to advance treatment. All payers should cover medication-assisted treatment and should remove administrative barriers to treatment, including prior authorization. This has long been a priority of the AMA, and I would like to share a recent success. Do we have anyone in the audience from Pennsylvania? Very good. Hopefully you heard that just a few weeks ago, the Commonwealth announced a landmark decision reached with the state's 7 largest health plans. They agreed to remove prior authorization for medication-assisted treatment, and they agreed to provide medication-assisted treatment on the lowest cost-sharing tier. This agreement was unprecedented and will save many lives. Because when patients are forced to delay care or they are denied care because of administrative barriers, they may face fatal consequences. Policymakers and regulators must also enforce parity laws. Parity laws have been on our books for 10 years, but they are not enforced. So we have to make sure that parity laws are enforced for mental health and substance use disorder, so patients receive the same coverage benefits for these conditions as they do for other health conditions. It is unimaginable for us not to treat a person who comes into the emergency department with a blood glucose of 450, or to give them a piece of paper and tell them to come back in 6 weeks. And so we cannot do that for those who have a chronic illness such as substance use disorder. All payers and pharmacy benefit managers must ensure that patients have access to affordable, non-opioid pain care. And I make the point about equitable access. It is not equitable when perhaps there is a $10 copay for a 7-day prescription of an opioid, but for physical therapy, there's a $40 copay for each visit, and oftentimes the requirement is 3 days a week. That ends up being no access at all. So when we talk about access, we have to make sure that it's equitable access to non-pharmacologic, non-opioid alternatives to treat pain. And again, we must continue to fight the stigma faced by those struggling with substance use disorders. Again, the aggressive work, and we should be aggressive. This is an epidemic. And so we have to have appropriate zeal. But in the aggressive work to limit opioids, this has increased the stigma among patients with opioid use disorder and has added stigma to those patients suffering from chronic pain. The AMA repeatedly hears from patients and their physicians who have received opioid therapy for chronic pain and have been stable for years, who are now made to feel like addicts, and that is the word that I personally don't use. I really feel that as we address stigma, we have to be very careful with our language, but this is how they are made to feel and questioned repeatedly because they benefit from opioids. The nation's opioid supply is decreasing, but access to multidisciplinary pain care, including, again, the non-opioid alternatives, remains a challenge. A recent survey by the American Board of Pain Medicine highlights the plight of patients with pain and the barriers to providing multidisciplinary non-opioid care. The physicians surveyed said 93% of them have been required to submit a prior authorization. 68 have had to hire additional staff just to handle the prior authorization. And as we think about the cost of health care in this country, just think about that. We're hiring additional staff just to handle prior authorizations. And 83% of the pain medicine specialists said that they or their patients have been required to reduce the quantity or dose of medication they have prescribed. This is about individual decisions made between the patient and their physician. Respondents to the survey listed a wide range of non-opioid therapies that have been subject to prior authorization, including physical therapy limits, psychiatric services, occupational therapy, pain cream, patches, non-opioid prescription medications, and non-opioid pain treatments. If all we do as a nation is restrict access to one form of pain relief without increasing access to other options, The result will be to increase patient suffering, and we certainly cannot tolerate that. So we believe that if health plans and others restrict opioid prescribing, they must, again, make the non-opioid alternatives available and affordable. Employers also have a role to play. Non-opioid alternatives sound great, again, until employees start asking for time off from work for mindfulness or physical therapy. It sounds great until we realize that transportation may be a barrier. It sounds great until we realize that lack of access to child care might be a barrier. It sounds great if you have insurance in the first place, but what about those who are uninsured and underinsured? So we must work with employers to enhance access to non-opioid pain care, put an end to stigma. And I will close here again because it plays so much into the policy surrounding the opioid epidemic. We have to confront the intangible and often devastating effects of stigma. The key to recovery is support and compassion. Patients in pain and patients who have a substance use disorder need comprehensive treatment and not judgment. So thank you for your attention. I look forward to hearing from my fellow panelists and look forward to hearing the discussion later on.
Thanks so much, Patrice. Next, we're going to have Sarah Akerman, who's Senior Medical Director at Alkermes. She's also has an adjunct appointment at Dartmouth Medical School and has had a remarkable career, and I'm delighted to have her being able to speak on the great work that Alkermes is doing.
Thank you, Bob. Good morning, everyone. So mental health and substance use disorders are the leading cause of disease burden in the United States. These disorders have a far-reaching impact on society beyond the individual patient, beyond even the healthcare system, to the criminal justice system, and to our communities at large. When we consider the opioid epidemic specifically, as you heard from Dr. Harris, the numbers are really staggering. 116 people dying every day. Opioid overdose driving down the U.S. life expectancy. Fortunately, there are effective treatments available. There are 3 types of effective medications, evidence-based medications for the treatment of opioid use disorder. Methadone, buprenorphine, extended-release naltrexone, all have a strong foundation of evidence to support them. But unfortunately, most people with opioid use disorder do not receive these effective medications. And this is due in part to our dysfunctional treatment program. So I'm going to talk about 3 things today. So one is our inadequate substance use disorder treatment system. And the second is the unfortunate lack of scientific innovation currently underway in the field of substance use disorder treatment. And third, some suggestions about how we must all work together to begin to change the treatment paradigm so that it can better accept scientific innovation and ultimately help patients get the medications that will help them. So first, the problematic treatment system. So shown here are the concentration of substance use disorder treatment facilities across the country. And as you heard from Dr. Harris, there's already a dearth of facilities for treatment. But when you consider how many of these facilities that are available actually provide medications, it's about half. So about half of these facilities prescribe an evidence-based, FDA-approved medication for the treatment of substance use disorders. What's even more concerning is that less than 3% actually prescribe all 3 of the FDA-approved medications for opioid use disorder. So our current treatment system is really not based on a medical model. FDA-approved medications are often fraught with stigma and misunderstanding, and even marginalized by certain factions of the addiction community where only one treatment or type of treatment is preferred. So what this means is the majority of patients with opioid use disorder are not actually getting evidence-based treatments. In many cases, they're undergoing medical withdrawal or detoxification and being released back into the community. And this places them at very high risk for overdose and death. I met a mother recently who spoke about her 23-year-old son named Jason, and she told me, this is a story we hear far too frequently, that it wasn't until his third stay at a residential treatment facility that they learned for the first time that he actually had multiple medication options to choose from. This is a dysfunctional, broken treatment system. This treatment system that does not readily accept innovation has, unfortunately, affected scientific innovation in this field. So despite the tremendous disease burden of opioid use disorder, there are only a handful of medications currently in development for this treatment. And this is in contrast to the impressive and very effective research and development ongoing in the oncology space, where there are approximately 1,500 medications in development. This is a stark contrast. And the challenge is that even the most innovative medications for the treatment of OUD, opioid use disorder, may well fail in our current treatment paradigm, unless the treatment centers become more accepting of evidence-based medications. So what are we doing to help change the treatment paradigm? So we as a company at Alkermes address this inadequate treatment system head-on with policymakers, with payers, with other stakeholders, to begin to ensure that patients have access to all of the evidence-based medications, regardless of what treatment center door they enter. As a company, we've been working in the addiction space for many years now, and through our work with Vivitrol, or extended-release naltrexone, an opioid antagonist, we've gained a deep understanding of the opioid system and the biology, and that's opened new possibilities for us as we consider longer-acting formulations of medications and new molecular entities. Importantly, we want to address outcomes that are most relevant to patients. We're also exploring novel approaches for the treatment of pain based on principles of biased agonism or functional selectivity. But even as we continue our internal work, we think it's critical to support external innovation. We believe that much more than scientific innovation is required to change the treatment paradigm. We support mental health and addiction communities through our Inspiration Grants program and have funded over $1 million to date in external programs that really reach patients and communities. We support independent research, scientific research, through our investigator-sponsored studies program. We also have a Junior Investigator Award program where we help support early career investigators who are looking to begin a career in the substance use disorder and mental health space. We also support independent medical education and healthcare-related events and initiatives. So we believe that through research, education, policy work, and community support, we can all begin to change the treatment paradigm to improve the ability of our current system to adopt scientific innovation so that effective medications can reach patients. Thank you.
Sarah, thank you very much. I'm going to now introduce Mike Heffernan, who's chairman of Collegium Pharmaceuticals, and they've also developed some very innovative approaches, and he's going to talk about that. Mike.
Thank you, Bob. Okay, I guess we're getting started. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the evolution of the pain market. And I think we all know the past. Dr. Harris talked about the past. The past is a past where, for chronic and acute pain, we had traditional opioids being prescribed, probably too many opioids being prescribed. And in addition to that, those opioids had very little to no abuse deterrent technology associated with them and were readily abused, whether it be by the oral route, the IV route, or the nasal route. We then have moved into the present, where we have the development of abuse deterrent opioids, and I'm going to talk about where that fits. We also have the development of some novel atypical opioids like tapentadol or Nucenta, which is a mu agonist and a norepinephrine reuptake blocker. We have both first generation and second generation abuse deterrent opioids. The future clearly is the non-opioid pain reliever that's safe and effective. But to get there, we have to bridge the gap. And the bridge of that gap is incremental innovation. And Collegium is focused on incremental innovation in getting us to a world where we had non-abuse deterrent opioids to a world that we all hope will come soon where we have non-opioid pain therapy for both acute and chronic pain syndromes. Now, let me talk for a second about abuse deterrent opioids. The whole concept of an abuse deterrent opioid is that somebody doesn't walk into a pharmacy, get a Percocet, take a Percocet one day and inject heroin the next. There is a well-known trajectory of abuse. And that trajectory of abuse is somebody tries an oral formulation, they like it, they need more. They go in, they get an extended release or a time release formulation because it's got more drug load. They crush that, break it, grind it, or chew it, and that gives them more of a high. So that's the first place an abuse deterrent opioid is intended to work, which is to protect the time release system from crushing, chewing, breaking, or grinding. Once that person does that, they move on to the next piece, which is snorting. And when you snort an opioid, you increase your risk of a major medical effect by 2.2 times versus the oral route. Again, abuse deterrent opioids are intended to prevent the snorting of these products through that illicit route. So once you've snorted, then you move on to the next phase. And the next phase is injection. And whether you're injecting the prescription opioid or whether you're injecting or smoking heroin, the intent here is the abuse deterrent opioid will prevent you from injecting that particular opioid. And then at the end, you come down to heroin. Now, as was stated earlier, illicit fentanyl and heroin have changed this trajectory a little bit. And we now hear plenty of cases where people are going directly to illicit fentanyl. And from there, moving on to both the heroin and fentanyl addiction and epidemic that we're seeing today. Now, the FDA has been very supportive of the development of abuse deterrent opioids. There are a number of abuse deterrent opioids listed on this slide that have abuse deterrent claims in one form or another. All abuse deterrent opioids are not the same. They have different functions. They have different technologies. And they all play a different role. The FDA has also taken action where they have removed or denied approval of opioids that don't have enough abuse deterrent activity, whether it be the removal of Opana ER from the market or the denial of products for approval at AdCom, and finally in the approval process if they did not have sufficient abuse deterrent technologies. And the last piece is a class-wide removal of all non-abuse deterrent opioids. This has not happened to date. This is something that gets talked about by the FDA commissioner, that he foresees a day when all opioids on the market have abuse deterrent capabilities. Now, at Collegium, what we did was relatively simple and I think somewhat elegant. What we did is we took the oxycodone, and it can be done with any opioid, and we took the hydrochloride salt, which is what's used in all of the opioids on the market, and we changed the salt, and we made a fatty acid salt. So it's an oxycodone murostate salt, and we patented that. Now, why is that important? Oxycodone hydrochloride is very hydrophilic. You put it in water, it readily dissolves. You can inject it, you can abuse it. So if I can get it out of the pill, I can abuse it easily. Oxycodone murostate is lipophilic, and you dissolve it in fats and waxes. So we dissolve it in a proprietary mix of fats and waxes. We use a proprietary manufacturing process, and we create these little beads. And these little beads are about the size of a grain of sand, and they're waxy and they're fatty. Well, if you take a fatty, waxy bead and you snort it, you don't have any enzymes in your nose, or you don't have anything to emulsify, so it goes down the back of your throat, and you're not going to get release in your nose. If I try to inject it, it's not soluble in water. I shake it up, it's a suspension in a syringe. It won't go through the needle. If I try to crush it, break it, or grind it, it's soft and waxy and small, so I can't change the particle size or the surface area. I also, because I have these little beads, can now put it down an NG tube or a G tube for patients who have some kind of pain where they can't swallow or they have dysphagia associated with their pain. So this is a technology that can be applied to all opioids. Now, the value, as I said, is to prevent crushing, breaking, or grinding. And what this slide shows from a study is that if you take immediate release oxycodone, you get 115 nanograms per ml in your blood. If you take our product Xtamza, you take it intact, you take it crushed, you take it chewed, you don't change the amount in your blood, which is what the abuser wants. They want that immediate high. If you snort it, you get less than if you take it orally. So why is somebody going to snort it? If you compare it to the market leader, OxyContin, what you can see on the left-hand side is if I crush Xtampza, its PK profile is exactly the same as if I don't crush it and give it in the pill. But if I crush OxyContin, it becomes an immediate release. You get the exact same release as taking immediate release, 40 milligrams of oxycodone. So even though both have abuse deterrent claims, the products have a differentiation. And what that's allowed is health plans and physicians to make choices around the different qualities of abuse deterrent opioids. Now, you also have to do recreational drug abuser studies where you take the drugs and you give them to recreational drug abusers and they rank. How do they like this in a likability scale? And what you can see is here, whether you chew it, crush it, take it with food, don't take it with food, there's no change in likability by a recreational drug abuser for either nasally and or orally. Now, the thing I'll finish with is even though we have all this innovation going on with opioids and we have incremental improvement as we look for a world of non-opioids, we still have over 3 million, 3.5 million prescriptions a week of opioids in the United States. Over 3 million immediate release opioids. Of those, only 2% of all the opioids prescribed by the doctors have abuse deterrent properties. And 0.5% have atypical properties which may have some less addiction. So the opportunity here is not just innovation. It's figuring out how we get the adoption and evolution of the market to make sure that we have the safest opioids possible on the market for the pain patients who need them. Thank you.
Mike, thank you very much. So our last speaker is Corey McCann, who's President and Chief Executive Officer at Pear Therapeutics, and they've developed, I think, a very novel way of thinking about doing all this and have FDA approval for a new app, which I'm sure we'll hear about. So Corey, thank you.
Great. Thanks, Bob, and thank you to the Galien Foundation for having me. I think also thank you to the Foundation for choosing to feature substance use disorder and opiate use disorder as an area of import. I think if you're looking for success in biotech, this is not the place you start. I think as you heard from the rest of the panelists, this is a landscape where 95% of patients can't access care, where there are 10 products in the pipeline, and where most clinicians do not prescribe all of the FDA-approved medications to treat this condition. So I think that there is really no shortage of opportunity here and no shortage of unmet need. What I'm here to talk to you about this morning is hopefully a part of the solution, which is specifically our work at Pear Therapeutics around this emerging space of digital therapeutics. And so I know that this tends to be a new concept for people. Let me just do a quick audience survey. And so by a quick show of hands, for how many of you is this the first time that you're hearing about this term of a digital therapeutic? That's a smaller number than I was expecting. For the people who did not raise your hand, how many of you think that you've heard of it and you actually understand what it is? So how many of you have some sort of a clarity of insight around digital therapeutics? That's a relatively large gap here. And really what I hope to do today is to create a bit of clarity on just what these things are, and then to also give you a sense for how we are redefining standards of efficacy and access within substance use disorder and opiate use disorder. So I know that you'll all be here for a long day, and so I wanted to make this just a little bit more interactive. We have no slides and just a short video. But maybe as just a very brief primer for those of you who are not aware of what a prescription digital therapeutic or a digital therapeutic is, this is very simply software as a drug. So these are pieces of software that are developed for use in patients. They're developed for physician prescription. They are dispensed by a specialty pharmacy, just like a drug. And most importantly, they are run through randomized clinical studies to examine and demonstrate rates of safety and efficacy. They're then taken through an FDA approval process where we wind up with drug-like efficacy claims, and they are used and reimbursed as traditional medical and pharmaceutical benefits. So what I hope you took away from that is the notion that this is software on the front end, biotech on the back end. And that's exactly the company that we've built at Pear. We're one half a software company, one half a biotech company. I think to maybe make this a degree more concrete, I'd like to take us into our lead products in substance use disorder and opiate use disorder respectively. That's our Reset and our Reset O products. And so you'll see in just a very short video exactly what these things are and how they work. But very simply, these are physician prescription apps that enhance the treatment of substance use disorder and opiate use disorder. So the patient comes to the physician, they are diagnosed with one of these conditions, and in the same visit, they receive a script, they get access to the product, and they start to use the product in a place where there is no wait between between diagnosis and prescription. The Reset and Reset O products are derivative of a type of face-to-face therapy that generates efficacy in addiction conditions. This is exactly the type of face-to-face therapy which is proven, which is evidence-based, and which is indicated, but which is not available in most of the shaded states that you saw on one of Patrice's slides. So I think at this point what I would like to do is just to make this, again, more specific. And so we have a short video. Is the team able to show a short video? Great.
Pear Therapeutics is redefining medicine as the pioneer in prescription digital therapeutics, or PDTs, disease treatments that are designed to provide better outcomes for patients by using software to directly treat disease, delivered by your phone instead of a pill or injection. For patients, it offers greater consistency and accessibility of treatment when you want it and need it most. For clinicians, it's designed to offer greater insight into patient and disease behavior, which could improve clinical outcomes. Pear Therapeutics is the first company to receive FDA authorization for a PDT to treat disease with our lead product Reset, a clinically proven treatment for substance use disorder, and is developing the potential for digital therapies to treat a wide range of serious diseases, from mental illnesses such as schizophrenia and depression, to severe insomnia, depressive symptoms and multiple sclerosis, and more. Reset addresses a significant unmet need for patients suffering from addiction. Here's how it works. Once your doctor prescribes Reset, you can download the app through the App or Google Play Store with your clinician. The power of Reset is based on cognitive behavioral therapy, allowing patients to self-report drug and alcohol usage, cravings, and triggers, and to complete 62 individual assessments, offering lessons based on life skills, mood management, social triggers, overall health, and more. At the end of each lesson, there's a reinforcement quiz, and rewards are earned for completing lessons and passing clinician-administered drug tests. Patients are required to complete 4 assessments each week, and throughout the 90-day prescription period, clinicians get a real-time view of patient progress. Reset could redefine the standard of care for those struggling with addictions, and Pear Therapeutics is redefining medicine by pushing the boundaries of technology in pioneering prescription digital therapeutics.
So what you just saw there was the first piece of software to ever be authorized by the FDA to treat any disease. That's a watershed moment for us and also for patients in the space. All of what we do is rooted in randomized clinical trial data. And for that particular product, the data that supports its market authorization is a 399-patient, 10-center nationwide randomized clinical study. The study was run in the National Institute of Drug Abuse Clinical Trials Network. And here, patients were enrolled and they were block randomized to receive either the Reset product or the best face-to-face care that they could possibly receive. So something called intensive outpatient therapy. This is about 4 hours per week of face-to-face care. That's the exact same care that none of the patients on any of the maps that we saw are able to receive. The study was run just like a drug study in that the primary endpoint was abstinence as assessed by twice-weekly urine drug screen. And the primary endpoint in the study was abstinence in weeks 9 through 12, so aggregate abstinence at the end of the study. That Reset product more than doubled rates of abstinence versus best-of-breed face-to-face care. That was true for patients addicted to alcohol, cannabis, cocaine, and stimulants. This is the only product with labeled claims for the treatment of cannabis use disorder, cocaine use disorder, and stimulant use disorder. You will note that I did not mention opiates. That is our product to follow, Reset-O. And so we are right on the precipice, and I don't think I have anything wooden here to knock on, but we are right on the precipice of our Reset-O market authorization, which will specifically treat patients with opiate use disorder. That product will be the first FDA-cleared drug software combination, and it is a product with similar data to enhance rates of efficacy in the treatment of opiate use disorder when used in combination with buprenorphine. So what I hope is that people now have a little bit of a better sense for what is a digital therapeutic and for how it plays a role in the treatment of substance use disorder and opiate use disorder. And I hope to also convey a good deal of excitement. The two products that I just discussed are part of our partnership with Novartis Pharmaceuticals. And those are products which are being detailed nationwide with a launch in Q4 of this year. So as we speak, there are patients using these products. This is the first time that pharma has ever directly detailed a piece of software. And so I think this is a really interesting mindset shift in terms of treatment modality. And really, we think that this is one of the core modalities that will allow us to not only redefine standards of efficacy, but also address all of the access issues that you heard from the other panelists. So thank you.
Corey, thank you so much. So we have about a little over 20 minutes for questions, and I think I want to just first of all thank the speakers. I think you heard some remarkable stories of innovation, but also I think some real concerns about the healthcare system in terms of making some of these innovations available to patients and other issues as well. So why don't I'd be happy to have anybody ask questions. We have microphones, and so any hands? Sure. Do you? And maybe people could identify themselves when they speak.
Hi, is that on? Yeah? I'm Omar Manajwala. I'm the Chief Medical Officer for CADASYS. Incredible work you all are doing in this space. I guess my question is, since over half the people who are prescribed opioids have untreated behavioral health conditions like depression and anxiety, and most of the folks, as you mentioned, who have illicit fentanyl use and heroin use have untreated behavioral health conditions, what are your thoughts on innovating to solve the crisis of untreated co-occurring behavioral health conditions that run along this crisis?
Who would like to? Would you want to start? Or?
I think we start with what we have right now. We talked about the need to make sure our parity laws are enforced. I think we are already working on a foundation of a totally inadequate infrastructure to treat both those with substance use disorders and mental disorders, and that has happened over the last 20 to 30 years. So on the foundation of an inadequate infrastructure, we have to make sure we enforce the laws on the books. We have to make sure there are more resources. We have to make sure that there's accountability and that the treatments that are offered are evidence-based. And so I think that's the way we move forward on this.
Yes, I would agree. You know, the prevalence of co-occurring mental health disorders and substance use disorders is really high. And so I think often, you know, providers and patients aren't really well equipped to recognize the importance of treating both disorders simultaneously. And I think through education and access, we can improve those results.
And if I could add one more, just a couple more things, the importance of integrating this treatment into primary care and into public health. We have to normalize this treatment, so the issue of integration and the issue of using telemedicine, telepsychiatry, I think, are two things that could get us further in making sure those disorders are treated.
Thank you.
Corey or Mike, anybody want to add anything? Or?
I think this all starts with the enforcement of mental health parity. I think that there are just so many patients that are out there that are not able to access any sort of care. And it's actually decidedly worse than it seems. I think when you look at all of these numbers, they seem bad, but they don't convey the human element. As we're out there having conversations with payers day in and day out, the degree of, I would say, overt parity violations is just, it's absolutely frightening. And so for me, I think that's the place to start, and with payment, quality care follows.
Next, other questions? Just looking. Yeah. Oh, yes.
I wonder if I could just ask Corey about some access to digital therapies. In the UK, there is a growing opioid addiction epidemic, and it's often associated with areas of considerable deprivation. And not everybody has the kind of smartphone that would enable access to the kind of technology that you were describing. Is that likely to be a problem in the States, and is there a way in which you can get around that in some way? I mean, how sophisticated does your phone need to be in order for you to use your technology?
So generally speaking, we try to minimize the number of barriers to patients receiving care. What that has meant for us is that we do not distribute phones, because what tends to happen in studies is that patients just don't use the phones that are not their primary phone. And so the way that all of our software is architected is that this is available via both iOS and Android. It's available on a number of previous generation devices across those two platforms. And it's also architected in a way that allows for data caching. So for people without a wireless plan, they're able to go for example, a Starbucks and download all of their progress and content for the week, and then come back and do it again the next week. I think of all of the barriers to care that we've seen, and there are many. I think that this issue of smartphone penetration, at least here in the US, has probably not been a top 5 issue for us. And I think the anecdote in addiction, at least, is that almost all of these patients have smartphones already, because that tends to be how they get their drugs. And so they have a very feed-forward relationship with their smartphones. I think that we've found the same thing across our other patient populations in things like schizophrenia and so on and so forth down our pipeline. But that said, we have not thought in a terribly articulate way about how to do this ex-US.
Question back. Can somebody bring the microphone? Thank you. And if people could again identify themselves, that would be great.
Hi, thank you. Andy Lester with Harla Capital. When you talk about smartphones, I mean, there's sort of more of migration now to like Apple type of phones, where you could directly have an app that reaches a patient in terms of reminding people of whatever they might need, but also the possibility of remote monitoring for compliance. Is that something that could really precipitate change? And I appreciate all of your sort of comments and thoughts, and as experts, I ask you, particularly from what I know sort of the financial end of healthcare here, there's not likely to be significantly greater financial resources committed just in light of other economic limitations that I see. I just wonder, as you oversee all elements of healthcare, whether there's the possibility of sort of redistribution of some spending in a way that could address the concerns and problems that you've noticed, while at the same time putting sort of some cap on the total number of resources required to address the problem.
Be happy to have everybody. Who would like to go first on our panel?
I would say there has been some additional resources over the last several years, first with the 21st Century Cures Act and with CARA, and then the legislation signed yesterday. That was bipartisan legislation regarding the opioid use. So there is a promise there and a significant number of resources. And as some of us last night were discussing at the dinner, we do have to make sure that the resources that are coming down the pike now are spent on evidence-based treatment. So that's the first thing. But there have been significant resources, and we should continue to I believe, advocate for additional resources. We certainly appreciate the context of where we are today, but we have to make sure that there are resources. And we can look at innovation to help with that. And we can look at integration of substance use disorder treatment and treatment for bipolar disorder, depression into primary care. So we can look at all of those things as we continue to look towards new payment delivery models. The AMA has worked with ASAM, the American Society of Addiction Medicine. Virginia did not expand Medicaid, but they received a Medicaid waiver, and they were able to increase access to medication-assisted treatment, increase reimbursement, and reduce cost in their emergency departments, again, because of that access to treatment. So the one thing I would say we also need to do is to try to have a broader view of our finances and to not look in our silos as we tend to do, again, because that's savings in the emergency department, probably increase cost if you look at the pharmacy costs, because now folks are receiving buprenorphine. So, but when you look systematically, there are likely savings. So we have to make sure we have a broader view on that.
Mike?
Yeah, I think there are pretty good models out there for some other epidemics. HIV is a great example. And if you look at the HIV epidemic and you look at the multi-pronged approach that went with education, prevention, treatment, the problem with the opioid epidemic is the target keeps moving, right? First it was a focus on prescription opioids. Now we have a focus on illicit fentanyl and things coming through the border. And so coordination of activities and coordination of care from all the buckets of people who fund is one of the biggest issues, in my opinion. We don't have that coordination of efforts across, can a physician get paid for all the work that they need to do in assessing a patient for opioid abuse while they're prescribing a chronic pain medication? Do they get paid for doing a urine drug screen? Do they get paid for doing a pill count? All these things cost more money. But if you look at the downstream savings, again, it's the old story of pay me now or pay me later. And coordination of care and getting the funding sources together, I think, is really the key.
Yeah, I would just add, as more funding becomes available, it's critical that that funding is geared towards evidence-based treatments. And as we've talked about, too often the treatment centers are not utilizing the appropriate treatments, and that money's not being used effectively to really reach patients.
Yeah, I think the rest of the panel addressed the resourcing question. With regard to data and transparency, I think the notion of a prescription digital therapeutic is maybe a bit of an undersell. There is a diagnostic that is pushed along with these things. And so we are always collecting 3 buckets of data. I think we know, number one, everything about engagement, what the patient is using, when they're using, what they're using well, what they're not using well. We push, in the case of Reset and Reset O, what's called the timeline follow-back assessment twice weekly. That's a validated surrogate endpoint for many addiction clinical trials. And then we have a clinician dashboard that allows the clinician to enter urine drug screen data. And it's really from the cross-correlation of those 3 data sets that we're able to demonstrate that the product is working, but also to be able to continue to enhance the product. And so I think your question is very apt in that these things go hand in hand. I think that there needs to be more resourcing, but there also needs to be more transparency so that that resourcing winds up actually helping patients and actually reducing overall costs.
Thank you. Yes.
So I have a question. My name is Barbara Reed. I'm with AdPrime, a digital publishing, health publishing platform. My question is, what is the barrier to entry for is it naloxone? What is the one that saves people's lives that you can use the pen?
Naloxone is an overdose reversal agent, yes.
Right. So what is the problem with getting that into the hands of more community members, paramedics, et cetera? And is there a DTC potential for that with families that are suffering and, expect their child or family member to die, and it prevents death? I've seen it in, firsthand. bring someone back to life, really, essentially. So the question is, what is the problem with getting deeper distribution, and is there an opportunity for it to be direct to consumer?
So we'll say that that is a somewhat of a success story regarding naloxone. The Surgeon General, if you've heard him speak lately, he's talked about the need to have everyone, he believes that we should all carry naloxone in our pockets. Again, state health authorities have written blanket prescriptions so that members of their community can get that. So actually, we've done a pretty good job of at least getting access to treatment. Now, one issue that I've heard from first responder communities and from counties are budgets and affording it that way. So that is one barrier. But I think many of the barriers have been reduced regarding access to naloxone. And as you heard me say earlier, the AMA encourages physicians to co-prescribe it. But then it gets to, there have been some barriers of maybe I co-prescribe it to mom, or my plan is to co-prescribe it to mom because of their son, but because the son is the patient, it may not be paid for by the payer. So I think it's some of those payer barriers and cost barriers.
Yeah, there have been significant strides in access and understanding of naloxone as a life-saving treatment. Just to clarify, though, I mean, it is a life-saving treatment for overdose, but in and of itself is not a treatment for opioid use disorder. But it's clearly a very, very important part of our treatment system. I think we are hearing at times that with the introduction of fentanyl and other more potent synthetic opioids, at times our current overdose reversal agents are not keeping up, are requiring multiple doses in order to reverse an overdose. So I think that's an opportunity certainly for more innovation, to have more effective, as the epidemic progresses and changes, ever-changing, to have more effective overdose reversal agents as well.
Thank you, sir. Other questions? Yes.
Hey, I'm Stefan Schroeder. I'm from Langland. We're a health and wellness advertising agency, part of Publicis Health. And Corey, to you, your answer to that is the access question is that that's not in your top 5 sort of barriers to the digital therapy. Can you tell me what the sort of top 5 barriers are in your perception, please?
Sure, and I just want to clarify that blanket access, so I spend most of my time thinking about access. The part of access which is not top 5 is whether patients have smartphones or not. So I just want to make sure that we're clear there. My maybe top 3, my top 2 are payer level access. So really communicating the value proposition to payers in a situation where this is doubly hard because this is a new treatment modality in an area where payers are apt not to pay. So I think that is probably our first focus. That is our first key risk. And then our second focus and second key risk is in educating the clinician population so that they are confident to write the scripts, and then so that they actually follow along with the patient participating with the prescription digital therapeutic. And both of those things are hard enough to populate an entire top 5 list. We could sort of break those into sub-bullets. But I mean, maybe just on the clinician piece, we don't talk about it often, but for physicians, for nurse practitioners, for other clinicians who are writing scripts for buprenorphine, they are waivered clinicians, and they are signing to the extent that they're providing behavioral support along with this buprenorphine script. And many of those clinicians don't know that that's a requirement, despite the fact that they're educated that it's a requirement. And many of the other clinicians know that it's a requirement and don't act upon it. So I think it just gives you a sense for the headwind. I think all of the trends would support that this is a big problem, that clinicians need to address it, that payers need to pay, and that we have some interesting solutions to try to impact efficacy and access. But it's still really, really hard.
Over there.
My name is Honorio Silva. I'm from IFAP, the International Federation of Pharmaceutical Physicians. I'm curious about the PDT as a concept of therapy. Because if I understand correctly, this is a fantastic digital tool to assess compliance, adherence, and therapeutic response. So what makes it different to other digital tools from the past used to assess compliance or even to assess therapeutic response? What's the value of the prescribing physician, the primary care physician, and how do you assess adherence? Because in chronic therapy, after 2 months or 3 months, the compliance rate is low. So how do you define PDT as a suitable alternative therapy, or not, but not a digital tool?
I think it's a good question, and I think this speaks to some of the difficulty in communicating a new therapeutic modality. I don't believe that the world needs more data. I don't believe that the world needs more compliance tools. I think the world needs more efficacy, and that's really the focus of the PDT. All of our products produce a neuroplasticity effect, and so they are basically pieces of software interacting with the eyes, repatterning the nervous system in order to produce the desired clinical outcome. In the case of Reset and Reset-O, that is to produce abstinent behavior, and the data that underlies our approval is abstinence data. So these are products that directly produce efficacy, and really what we are trying to do is to use that efficacy data to reset, full pun intended, standard of care, so that clinicians understand that not prescribing the Reset product is not providing standard of care. I think that all of the elements around showing the clinician data, that's a nice to have, that's not a critical. This is about efficacy and this is about access. And your compliance question is very apt. We collect all of that data. We have a data science team that sits on the back end. And we've really discovered some interesting things, like, for example, just rates of tapping. The way that a patient interacts with the app within the first week of use is probably the best predictor that you can have as to whether that patient is going to complete the entire 12 weeks of their therapeutic course. And so what it allows us to do is to take our hub services capability and to then provide face-to-face and human resources to help to understand reasons of non-use and to get those patients back on track. So maybe the most important thing here is that this is a direct efficacy effect, and that's really what defines the PDT.
Thank you. Yes, back there. And this will probably be, you had a question? And this will probably be maybe the last one, we'll say. Can you?
What percentage of patients that have chronic pain are able to tolerate opioids? You mentioned that. You mentioned that there was a population that was able to tolerate opioids. Is that a fairly large population? And the second question I have is, you mentioned illicit drugs. What percentage of drug abuse today comes from illicit opioids versus drugs that are manufactured legally?
Do you want?
Yeah, I'll speak to the illicit drugs. I don't know the percentage today of illicit. What I can tell you is in individual surveys, I'll give you an example. In Massachusetts, Public Health did a survey and or analysis of their overdose deaths, and over 80% of the overdose deaths in the last analysis were from illicit fentanyl. If you look at that data back 10 years ago, that's not what you'd see. You'd see very much a different picture, which prescription opioids were the primary issue. Going to the question about chronic pain, there's a number of people who can't tolerate opioids for chronic pain, and that's why you can't just use and rely on opioids for chronic pain. You need to rely on non-opioid therapy. You need to rely on non-medication therapy. You need to have a very comprehensive approach, including physical therapy, to chronic pain. Opioids are very useful, and some people require them, but it's the minority, in my opinion, that require them for the treatment of their chronic pain long term.
I'm just looking at the time, so we have 7 seconds left, so I think we'll have to go outside, I think, if there's more questions. But I want to just thank everybody, the panel, and all the audience for all the questions and great presentations. Thank you so much.